Okay. Well, I did have one final question, Sam, before we get you out of here, and that's involving Mr. Joe Rogan. We talked a lot about Joe Rogan the last time you stopped by Vanguard. I think we got
Right.
into a little bit his, the misinformation he was spreading, whether or not he should be allowed to spread it. Largely whether or not social media companies should be in the business of regulating that kind of disinformation. But uh, Joe Rogan's actually made the news more recently for an interesting reason. And I'm really interested, Sam, if you think this is a good idea. There's been a report that not just Donald Trump, but Kamala Harris also is seeking the Joe Rogan platform for an interview. This Newsweek article here says why Kamala Harris needs Joe Rogan to fix her male voter problem. And as you see here, it says Kamala Harris is reportedly planning on appearing on Joe Rogan's hugely popular podcast, as polls suggest that the vice president needs a boost in winning over male voters from Donald Trump. And I'm honestly genuinely torn, Sam, on whether or not this is a good idea from Kamala's perspective. I can see how it would be beneficial if she does well, but I also really worry that it would just turn into 2 hours of Joe Rogan arguing with her about all of his crazy vaccine conspiracies and trying to drag her down this rabbit hole that she's not really prepared to go down, because most normal people, even most politicians, they're not consuming this content. They're not aware of everything Dr. Robert Malone has said about
Right.
Operation Warp Speed. She might be out of her element. I don't know, man. I worry that it's not a good idea, but what do you think?
Um, I guess I'm sort of agnostic about it, to be honest with you. Like my sense is that um Joe Rogan doesn't have the ability to do a follow-up question on anything of any substance. I do think that like he could just start going like, I'm telling you, I know my sister's cousin said that there's, kitty litter in the classrooms. And what are you going to do about that? And I don't know her ability, frankly, to say, that's fake. But I'll tell you what I will do. I mean, she should be able to handle that, right? She should be. She should be able to go and say, and I think, right, like for instance, Brett Baer is a tougher questioner than Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan may spew a bunch of misinformation, but I think that like as soon as she pivots to any policy questions, like um, I think she's in pretty good shape. To be honest with you, I mean, it's like it's stunning that she came out with a proposal for home health care for elderly people on via Medicare. And I could tell you, as someone who has for the past like 3 or 4 years been dealing with this with my mom, like this is a huge policy that it doesn't necessarily resonate with, like, when you're your guy's age, like you're just not thinking about that stuff because you're not dealing with it. But there's a whole set of policies I think that she could be pushing. Like it would be interesting to see if he pushed her on Israel and Gaza, but I don't know where he is on that, to be honest with you. And I suspect he's probably closer to their position than not.
What
But
about as far as just reaching young men? Because obviously there's all the policy conversations, and I think that you're right. She could probably do a pretty good job of being convincing, even in the face of a couple follow-ups from a guy like Joe Rogan. He's not exactly a Mehdi Hassan level interviewer, debater, whatever you want to call it. He's pretty easy to get along with for the most part. But what do you think about reaching young men? I personally think
I
it's a
think that
missed opportunity not to send Tim Walz out there more. I think he actually is really
100%.
relatable. But I mean, I don't think that young men are like incapable of wanting to vote for Kamala Harris. I think a lot of them appreciate the idea of having like a strong woman at the head of the country, leading the country. I don't think it's like, even dude
Mamala.
bro types, even dude bros that might have some toxic tendencies. Like, I don't think it's out of the question for them.
I don't, I suspect that it is less about trying to convince young male followers. I mean, that's his demographic. I'm not convinced that it's about necessarily trying to convince, maybe some. I mean, it's come down to like, it's going to come down to some very thin margins in the Rust Belt, or it could. I also think it's about a larger narrative of like, oh, she's not a radical. Like I think like their whole campaign seems to be like, we have to, I as a Black woman am coded for a significant part of the population that is gettable as a radical because I am a Black woman. I mean, I think that like that's the thing that they've been trying to run away from the entire time. And I think going on that show or saying that you're willing to go on the show just adds one more layer of like, well, she didn't seem that crazy, and she's doing it, she's not hiding out. She has nothing to hide. Mm-hmm. I think there, that's the theory there, that they're less concerned about like what actually happens on there, and more like the idea that she would do it.
So I think it's kind of dumb, right? You'd think, hey, why don't you just, in the same way that her first televised interview was her and Tim Walz, why don't you just say, hey, yeah, dude, me and Tim Walz will both come by the JRE, and whenever it gets into the weeds and Joe Rogan wants to talk about policy, that could be more of a Kamala thing, but whenever it gets uncomfy, Tim Walz will just circle back to how he likes to hunt, and that will be good for 40 minutes of sending Joe off the rails in another direction. He'll talk about how he only does bow hunting, and he doesn't trust anything that's killed with a bullet, unless it's an innocent American, in which case he's perfectly happy to support that.
I mean, they're scared. They've run a very, very, very cautious campaign, I think, since like at one point they switched gears. Right. They went from like Republicans are weird to, Republicans
are awesome.
I'm friendly. Yeah. And I think there was like, is she too afraid to come on Joe Rogan without Tim Walz? I think the idea that she is afraid to come on without without Walz, gets into that sort of like, misogynistic sort of coding on some level, to be honest with you. So I think she can go on there. I think she'll be fine. I don't think like we're going to go like, Rogan got owned, but I think like they feel they could, if they just come in there and come out and it's a neutral thing, the benefit is that she's willing to do that. Trump is not willing to do, well, I mean, I guess he did it at the National Association of Black Broadcasters, or whatever that group was. I guess they were somewhat hostile towards him.
This is what you should really do. Light up with Joe. Instant 50-state sweep. Kamala Harris smokes weed on the Joe Rogan Experience, lights a blunt. She only has to take a few puffs, too. She doesn't have to get blitzed.
It made Elon Musk
50-state sweep. Yeah, exactly.
I wonder if they have data that shows like where his audience is from. Somebody has that data, right? Like you can go and look on, I know like, I think it was on my podcast stats. Like I could sense like what state are people in? I couldn't say this individual is in that state, but I could say like, oh, I've got 2,000 listeners in New York. Mm-hmm. I've got, 2,000.
Sure Rogan has tons of them from every state, right?
I would imagine, but I would, they could be looking at like he's got 10,000, 100,000 listeners in Pennsylvania, and be like, all we need to do is peel off 4% of that, and that can make a big difference. So
true.
I think it's worth doing.
Yeah. I would agree. Also, I think that the juice is going to be worth the squeeze, even if she doesn't perform great. Especially after how well she did with the debate. Everybody thought she was going to shit the bed with the debate, and I thought she kind of wiped the floor with Donald Trump and had one of her best moments since the DNC.